first question should be, obviously, what's your name?
Josh Davis.
Okay, what branch of the military were you in?
I was in the U.S. Army and I was active duty.
Where were you deployed to?
I was stationed in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and the only deployment I had was to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba.
And could you describe what basic training was?
Well, basic training is where they bring everybody in, and the purpose of the drill sergeants or the drill instructors is to break everybody down and make them the same. And then they train everybody the same, and you graduate the same. So how basic training was in the beginning, it was really rough and hard because you had to learn what somebody else wanted you to learn at the same time being screamed at, living with 40 other guys. But halfway through it, once everybody was trained the same and on the same page and the same rhythm, it became a lot easier. But it's tough. It was physically demanding. A lot of people dropped out.
What were some of the tasks that you had to do during basic training?
Other than physical fitness, running, push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, all the physical fitness is timed. It's the same as athletes would have to do, where you have to run a mile in so many minutes and you have to do so many sit-ups in a certain time frame. But the tasks are to make every soldier exactly identical is the purpose of basic training. So you're all identically physically fit, you're all identically dressed because you're all wearing the exact same clothing, and the basic skills of using a rifle or rappelling with ropes. Basic training, depending on your job, is different for everybody, because a lot of the people that go to like an infantry school, their basic training is a lot more physical. Where I went to an artillery school, and my basic training was really physical, but they mixed in another 4 weeks of artillery training. So it wasn't as, for me, it wasn't as rough as it was for one of my brothers who was infantry. We talk about it a lot.
So what was the reason you decided to join the military?
Back then, wasn't really doing anything with my life. I hadn't gone into college yet, and didn't want to live with my parents, and didn't really have a career path chosen. So I said, why not? If you don't know what you're doing, then go do this for a while and get out, and then you'll have a better idea.
So what were your assignments while you were at Guantanamo Bay?
I was an MP, and we were responsible for building Camp X-Ray, which is what you hear about down there now. We built it back a long time ago for a different purpose for felons. And I ran a maximum security facility, well, not run, but worked at. And then for the 4 or 5 final months that we were there, we ran a family camp. And it was all the Cuban migrants that were waiting to come to the United States. So when we got there, we were tasked with starting out with the, I guess you'd say, like the jail part of it, and running that in rotations. And then when we were getting ready to leave, we moved on to a different camp, and we were in rotations on that before we all headed home. And it was 2-man roving guard. You and a partner would patrol inside and outside of all the migrant camps.
So, what were some of the things that the felons that were there did?
Well, what had happened was, and this is back in 93, what had happened was any Cuban national that could make it to U.S. soil would be in processed. They would be accepted into the U.S. and start paperwork to become a legal citizen. And when Fidel Castro found out about that, what he did was he took all of his maximum security prisons, all of his felons, and brought them to the ocean and said, if you can make it to the United States, you're free. So the regular citizens, the mom, dad, grandpa, grandma, children, didn't get so much of a chance in the beginning to go to the U.S. Castro opened up all of his prisons, and all those people tried to get to the U.S. So the U.S. government got smart, and we put boats out in the ocean, naval ships, and they would intercept all that migrant traffic on the rafts, and they would bring those people back. And what we learned through intelligence is that Castro had a system of tattooing his felons of what their crime was, whether they were a rapist, a murderer, a thief, whatever. And we had big books, we had catalogs of what all of the tattoos meant and from which prisons, what they meant. And we would take those people, and if it wasn't anything at that point, if it wasn't anything crazy for us, they would go into kind of one type of a military type camp. And if it was a serious crime, whether they were a murderer, or rapist, or something like that, they wound up over at Camp X-Ray, and then they would be repatriated back to Cuba. We had a process with the Marine Corps who ran the perimeter in the Cuban government where those people could be taken back to Cuba.
So what was one of the most memorable things that ever happened while you were at Guantanamo?
Memorable in two respects. One, Guantanamo is surrounded by a minefield. It's like a 1 kilometer wide minefield, or maybe it's a little bigger, all the way around the base to what is Cuba. And it was kind of unnerving at first, but when we first got down there, we used to go to sleep hearing, in the background you'd hear whoomp, whoomp. And coming from an artillery fort, I'm used to hearing the artillery shells landing in the impact zones. And the sound had a different sound to it. And what that sound was, it was people, mom, dads, kids, families, that were trying to come from communist Cuba through the minefield at night and surrender themselves to the Marine Corps to hopefully get placed in a family camp so they could go to the U.S. And there's no maps to the mines. So what that thumping was in the middle of the night is those were people dying that were trying to cross the actual minefields. So that was a memorable moment. You'll never forget that sound as long as you live. But then one of the other, I guess, really good memorable moments was a display of firepower is what it was. The Navy had a boat, and they've got a special gun system called it's not an AWACS. It's a what the gun is a Vulcan. It looks like an R2D2 with a pair of barrels in it. Yeah, it's exactly what it looks like. And they've got one on the front and one on the rear of a boat. And they took this whole line of confiscated boats that they had taken from all the migrants, and they towed them out about 1,000, 2,000 yards out in the bay. And they brought this attack boat in, and you heard the warning sirens go off on the boat. You heard the hydraulics fire up for the guns, and the guns turned around, and they took a string that was probably 100 yards long of boats tied up, and they unloaded, and all you heard was burp, 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 and wood and boats went flying, and all we heard on shore was just a burp, 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 and you'd see a little puff of smoke above the gun as it did it, and it just absolutely destroyed everything in the water. Everything was gone. So it was really impressive, actually. So that stuff's out there.
So this is gonna be not really about your actual deployment, but what is your view on like the more recent wars, such as the Gulf War and the Iraq War?
I think they're necessary from a protecting our country standpoint. I would rather fight the war over there than have the war come to us and have to fight it here. So I think to protect our country as a whole, I think it's necessary that it takes place, and if it was my preference, it takes place over there. Having said that, in both the Iraq and the Gulf and all the conflicts we have going on right now, I have two brothers that are over there and a good friend of mine that were all there. I don't necessarily support a lot of the reasoning behind some of the conflict and what we're up to. Like with the first Gulf War with Iraq and Kuwait, we kind of got sucked into that one because Kuwait was drilling, or Iraq actually was drilling diagonally underneath Kuwait, and they were side drilling to get to the oil. So there was all those details kind of came out later. So today we're over there, you know, combating ISIS, fighting ISIL. We're going after this faction and that faction, and what I support that, and I support doing it over there, but that's about it.